What you see here is an image of ruins in Rome. You can see the modern city in the background. What you see here are leftovers from the Roman Empire. And this is what's left. You see here it has become a tourist attraction. So people come here to admire the fake glory of Rome. But just think about it. Around 2,000 years ago, these ruins here were part of enormous buildings. Rome was the capital of the world. Yes, it was the world's capital. Eventually, around 1 million people lived in Rome. There was a Chinese migrant community, an Indian migrant community, an Israelite migrant community. You had a Celtic migrant community, so from all over the earth, you had communities represented in Rome. It was the capital of the world, but this was left of it. Rome still has its significance, though, to the Roman Catholic Church. Think about the Vatican. And it has its relevance for high schools that book trips over there. So Rome still has its significance, but it's not the center of the world like it used to. Well, behind the scenes, Rome still has a grip on the world's politics and world's economics, but that's another video. There are more economic centers today. In ancient times, 2,000 years ago, Rome was the capital of the world. You had the capital of the Chinese Empire. I believe it was called Luoyang or something like that. It was another center. And you had Londinium, today we call it London, was a regional center. And you had a center in the Americas, in Central America back then. So you didn't have many metropolitan areas. Today, you have many of them. Think about New York, think about Boston, think about Tokyo, think about Shanghai, think about London. So things have changed. There is, however, one big deception that many fall for. They think that the postmodern, cosmopolitan era that we're in can never fade away. Well, one thing is we have mortal bodies, so we live a maximum of 120 years in these bodies, so they won't be around forever in the bodies they have at the moment. Many won't even reach the age of 100, so they don't even experience all of the cosmopolitan era to begin with. And many of them are stuck at a 9-to-5 job. They only have relief days that they call holidays. So the post-modern cosmopolitan era that we're in, or the globalist era, if you want to call it like that, or the Anglo-American, now the Anglo-American era is over, but we're still in the globalist era. But the globalist era has one enormous weakness. And that weakness is, it is based on an artificial construct of the British Empire that's no longer around. Let me repeat this. The postmodern globalist era, or you call it the cosmopolitan era, has one big weakness. It's based on the former British Empire. That's why this globalist era was successful, because it succeeded. The British Empire was falling apart. But now that the British Empire is something of the past, now that in regions, nations have developed strong identities, what's going to be left of globalism? I'll tell you what's going to be left of globalism. Globalism is a philosophy. And this philosophy is used to justify the British Empire and its aftermath, globalization. Now, globalization is a process that happened worldwide. That's not something you can reverse. It happened. There is no way back. But globalism That is, the philosophy behind it is now coming to its end. During the colonial era, the excuse was that the quote-unquote white man had to civilize the world. Now that excuse was proven to be false very quickly. You had 2 world wars. The Second World War was an enormous trauma on the white population. So the world leaders realized that they need to get rid of this popular racism thing because it's quite dangerous. Then decolonization happened, and many of the former overseas territories of European colonial powers gained political independence. Well, actually it's political autonomy. There is no such thing as political independence in the world, but that's another subject. So they gained political autonomy, and the people of there began to develop their own identities and began to resist the colonial boss. And then the idea became globalism is there to move the world away from the colonial past into a new era of freedom, where liberal democratic values will triumph. For a long time, liberal democratic values did triumph. But the triumph of those liberal democratic values also led to much unnecessary pollution in societies. The introduction of the pill for women, before that, you had witches using potions to manipulate the fertility. Now they introduced the pill. They came up with feminism. They came up with a lot of stuff. And the introduction of the pill enabled women to be promiscuous without facing immediate consequences, which led to many abortions, which led to the falling apart of many family structures, which led to much social distrust. So those liberal democratic values caused a lot of harm. The liberal democratic values had some good stuff, like human rights, ending slavery. So not all the values that liberals stood for were wrong in themselves, but because they don't serve Christ, the good they come up with is used by the enemy to drag people into destruction. So the leftist elites, they brought some good things and some very bad things. And what's going on now, the bad consequences of the bad things they brought on the world are now manifesting, and people cannot avoid them anymore. During the era of globalization, that means the falling apart of the British Empire, you had radio coming up, you had TV coming up, mainstream media coming up, also the internet developed, so a lot of things changed rapidly. And it's those changes that hypnotized people from seeing what was happening, namely that they were being robbed by the world's elites. They were being robbed during the British Empire already, but then it was obvious that when the British Navy came around, that something was taken away from you. In the globalization era, where the United States became dominant, you were still being robbed while thinking you were going ahead. But now that all the dysfunctions and defects of the liberal era are becoming visible, now there is resistance worldwide. Now a lot of people want to go to the conservative idea of the nation state, which was another scam of the 19th century. So what you see now is that there are 2 camps forming, anti-globalists and the remaining globalists, and they're clashing with one another. And very few people see that this clash will lead to nowhere. So what's going to happen, this is not going to happen instantly. What's going to happen is that globalization will continue. I mean, it cannot be reversed. I mean, it's something that's happened. But the idea that justified globalization will not last. Especially after the Trump era. Many will not fall for it anymore. So what's just going to happen is that a lot of people are going to move back to the 19th century concept of the nation state, embracing the violence of the nation state at their own expense, and expense of their children and the future of their offspring. And then you'll have the remainder of the population that will just get along with the Islamic influences that are increasing in economics. And the United States will be around, but will not be that dominant decision maker that it used to be. I'm not saying that it's going to be like on this image over here, that the United States will be torn apart and destroyed by nuclear bombs, and it will become one big ruinous mess like Rome. Now, there were no nukes during the time of ancient Rome, but you get what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is what will become of America, that all those skyscrapers will become like this. Here's another piece of art that shows New York City. You still have skyscrapers, but there's grass growing everywhere. It's abandoned. Most people died, and things are deteriorating. I'm not saying that this is going to happen to the United States as a whole, nor to China, nor to Japan. I'm not saying that. It may happen if an enormous worldwide disaster happens, because such things also happen in human history. But it can happen. I'm not going to say this is what's going to happen. It may happen, but what is going to happen is that symbolically, the United States will lose its significance as well as its relevance. It may take a decade or two, but it will happen. The system will remain Apollonian, so white supremacy will remain as the system of the world. But this whole white privilege thing will decrease more and more, even though the institutions will remain racist. Because racism is centered around the worship of Apollo, which is this guy over here, Satan's Nephilim son, the sun god. So, understand that globalism is fading away at the moment. Globalization will never disappear until Christ returns. So, realize that the world that existed during the 1980s, 1990s, as well as the early 2000s, that world is not around anymore. Obama, when he was about to become president, he talked about change, change, change. He knew what he was talking about. We just didn't capture what he was saying. That postmodern, cosmopolitan world of the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and also the early 2000s, it's not around anymore. It's fading away. And for many of the privileged parts, it's going to get worse. Now, the good news is that believers can overcome and overrule all that's coming. This is not an end of the world scenario I'm talking about. It is an end of a world era, but not the end of the world itself. So it's time to embrace the changes going on and to adapt. Because many will refuse to adapt, and that will be at their doom, that will be at their expense and expense of their posterity. That means their children and their offspring. Throughout history, this happened. You had an empire, let's say you had the Egyptian empire that dominates the world. Then you had Moses appearing with the power of God, leading away the Israelites, which were slaves, and the Egyptian empire fell apart at God's hand. Well, actually it was at the hands of the Egyptians who resisted God's call. So they actually destroyed themselves, but it was God who was in charge of the situation. They destroyed themselves, but God was in charge. So God used their own violence to destroy the Egyptian empire, and the Israelites continued. But many of the Israelites in the desert did not want to let go of the Egyptian past. So they perished in the desert, and the next generation continued. Then you had the Assyrian era that came up. The Assyrian era ended, the Babylonian era, then you had the Medo-Persian era, then you had the Greek era that transformed to the Roman era, and the Roman era has been extended now throughout various empires that came out of the Roman, Greco-Roman civilization. And from the Greco-Roman civilizations, we are now at a transition from the Anglo-American era towards a new era where Islamic economics are becoming dominant and more important. How it will turn out exactly, I don't know, but we are in a transition now. Throughout history, there has been world cycles where you have one ethnicity dominating the world, and also in regions you have ethnicities dominating a region, and when their era ends, a new era comes, and there is a transition. In the transition, many people lose because they don't adapt. Those that adapt, they survive transition. Those that don't adapt are destroyed by the transition. So, this is the transition that's going on. Right now, as believers who ought to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, we don't know when Christ will return. We don't know how many world cycles he will allow. Just know that this is how the world works. You have world cycles. Some last 200 years, some lasted a bit longer, but those are cycles. And also in regions you have cycles. And when a cycle ends, a new begins. So know the time you're in, the time you are alive, and adapt. Adapt, be flexible, so you can overcome. Do not hold on to what those Babylon churches are telling you, because those Babylon churches are either portraying an unrealistic end of the world doomsday scenario, or they're pretending as if everything is fine, while it's not. Walk by faith. Be at peace.